Two OpenClaw releases landed back to back, and they actually changed the day-to-day feel of using the product. So this episode starts where it should: what changed, why it matters, and who feels it. After that, we move to OpenAI's Images 2.0 and why readable text inside synthetic images changes the usefulness of image generation. Then we close on YouTube expanding AI likeness detection. I'm Nova.
I'm Alloy.
And this is OpenClaw Daily. Today we are starting with the new OpenClaw release pair and the parts ordinary users will actually notice.
Better image defaults. Better logging when provider fallback happens. Tighter owner-only command behavior. Cleaner setup flow. Better cron and session state hygiene. That is the useful version of the story, and then we can unpack the details.
The release selection part is quick. The current pair for this show is v2026.4.21 and v2026.4.20. What matters is what is inside them. The first release moves the bundled default image generation path and the live media smoke tests toward GPT Image 2. If you use the built-in image lane, that is not cosmetic. A better default changes what people think the tool can do out of the box.
And this is where the story gets practical fast. If the default image path is better at readable text, denser layouts, and following structured instructions, people stop treating built-in image generation like a toy. It becomes more believable for thumbnails, posters, diagrams, menus, UI mocks, and all the ugly real-world jobs where previous image models used to fall apart.
The other important part is that failed provider candidates are louder in logs before fallback succeeds. That sounds small until you have lived the opposite. Silent fallback makes operators feel insane. The task finishes, but you do not know what actually happened, which path failed, which path took over, or whether the job was slower, worse, or more expensive than expected. Louder logs make the runtime easier to reason about.
That is one of the cleanest themes across this release pair. OpenClaw keeps getting less magical in the bad way and more legible in the good way. If a provider failed, say so. If a fallback path took over, say so. If the system rerouted, tell the operator. That is how a tool stops feeling like a black box and starts feeling trustworthy in actual work.
The security side is equally important. Owner-enforced commands now actually require owner identity instead of being reachable through loose fallback behavior. That is exactly how those commands should work. If software says a path is owner-only, it should fail closed, not quietly leak through some permissive side door.
There are also fixes that sound minor until you think about the operator experience. Slack thread aliases are preserved more reliably, which helps thread continuity actually stay continuous. Invalid browser accessibility refs fail fast instead of creating longer chains of weirdness. Packaged installs get a better plugin doctor recovery path, which matters because packaged setups are often where people decide whether a tool feels polished or fragile.
Then the earlier release in the pair is broader. The setup wizard gets clearer security warning flow, a loading spinner during model catalog fetches, and cleaner API key prompting. That is not fluff. Setup is the first trust boundary in a product like this. If it looks frozen, confusing, or sloppy around credentials, people stop believing in the software before they have even used it.
The session store change is one of the best examples of boring work that matters. Entry caps and age pruning now happen by default, so cron or executor backlog does not quietly bloat memory forever. That is exactly the kind of guardrail that makes a long-running system survive real life instead of only surviving demos.
And the cron state split is just healthy architecture. Runtime state moves into a separate job state.json, while GIT tracked job definitions stay stable. That means less config noise, cleaner diffs, and a much easier time understanding what changed because a human edited a job versus what changed because the scheduler simply kept doing its work.
Add in stronger system prompts, tiered model pricing support, compaction notices, and fixes across exec handling, codex transport, and plugin API behavior, and the overall shape becomes obvious. These releases are about making OpenClaw easier to inspect, easier to trust, and easier to keep running without accumulating silent nonsense.
And the reason to spend time on those details is that they change the way the product feels in ordinary use. Better defaults change first impressions. Better logs change debugging. Better setup changes confidence. Better state handling changes whether a system stays healthy after days of cron work instead of just after 5 minutes of testing. That is digestible to a wide audience because everyone understands the difference between software that quietly rots and software that stays understandable under load.
That is also what makes these changes more interesting than a feature count reading. None of this depends on a giant flashy new noun. It is a sequence of operator surface improvements. The app is clearer about what it is doing, clearer about who is allowed to do what, clearer about why a route changed, and clearer about where runtime mess belongs. For most users, that is exactly what turns a clever tool into a dependable one.
And if you zoom out, both releases are really about reducing avoidable friction. The image path gets more current. The logs get more honest. Permissions get tighter. Setup gets less ambiguous. Session storage gets harder to bloat. Cron state gets easier to review. Those are the kinds of improvements that rarely go viral and very often determine whether somebody keeps a tool in their daily stack.
Which is why this part of the show should sound like product reality, not theater. Most people do not need a speech about why versioning is philosophically important. They need to know what got better, what got safer, what got easier to debug, and what might change the way they use the software tomorrow morning. That is the useful frame for these two releases.
Now we get to v2026.4.20, which is the broader release and probably the more important one if you think in terms of operator surfaces rather than headlines. The first cluster is setup. The setup wizard gets clearer security warning flow, a loading spinner during model catalog fetches, and cleaner API key prompting. That may sound like interface polish, but setup is not just interface polish. Setup is where the product explains itself. If security warnings are confusing, if model discovery looks frozen, or if API key prompts feel muddled, the user starts the relationship with suspicion.
That is exactly it. Good setup is not nice-to-have decoration. Good setup is a trust boundary. It answers a bunch of silent questions for the operator. Is this product explicit about what it needs? Is it honest about what is happening? Does it look like it has been run by adults before? A loading spinner during model catalog fetches is a perfect example. Without it, a pause feels like failure. With it, a pause feels like work in progress. That is a tiny UI addition that prevents a very real category of the app is broken interpretation.
Cleaner API key prompting matters in the same way. Credential entry is one of the easiest moments for a user to lose confidence. If a product asks for keys in a sloppy way, the user does not just think, "This prompt is ugly." The user thinks, "What else in this system is loose?" So when the wizard becomes clearer around credential collection and security warnings, the product is not just easier to click through. It is easier to believe in.
Then there is the runtime and state side, and that is where v2026.4.20 gets especially interesting. The session store now enforces entry caps and age pruning by default so cron or executor backlog does not quietly bloat memory forever. This is a very operator-shaped fix. Session stores only become interesting when they get messy. If a long-running system quietly accumulates stale entries, eventually the product becomes slower, stranger, or more memory-hungry than anyone intended. By the time a human notices, the root cause is often buried under days or weeks of churn.
Bounding entries by count and age is what mature software does. It assumes reality will be noisy. Jobs will pile up. Background systems will retry. Execution lanes will leave residue. People will not babysit every store file by hand. So the product needs default guardrails against silent sprawl. That is what this change is. It narrows the gap between the product worked fine in testing and the product still works fine after a week of real life.
The cron change is equally important. Cron runtime state gets split into a dedicated job state.json instead of being mixed into the same tracked definitions people expect to remain stable. That is a really healthy separation. Job definitions are declarative. They describe what the scheduler should do. Runtime state is messy. It is last run timestamps, next run bookkeeping, transient execution facts, and the kind of churn that changes every time the system breathes. Mixing those together creates noise. Splitting them apart makes Git history cleaner, makes diffs more meaningful, and makes the scheduler easier to reason about.
And this matters even more in a product where users may inspect, sync, or version job definitions. If the runtime bits keep splashing into the same file as the human-authored scheduling logic, then the product creates unnecessary friction around source control and review. Separate state storage is not glamorous, but it is exactly the kind of design choice that keeps automation from feeling chaotic over time.
Then we get to tiered model pricing support. This is another change that may not sound dramatic until you place it in real use. Pricing is part of routing. Pricing is part of fallback logic. Pricing is part of operator decisions around which model should handle which job. If the system understands only one flat price shape, it becomes harder to reason about higher-end providers, larger context tiers, or different billing buckets inside the same vendor family. Tiered model pricing support makes the economics of routing more realistic. That means better visibility, better future scheduling logic, and better cost sanity when the product grows beyond a few toy defaults.
Stronger system prompts also landed, and that sits in a category people often wave away because prompt sounds soft. But in a product like OpenClaw, system prompts are not just stylistic. They influence tool boundaries, default behavior, escalation patterns, and how consistently the agent interprets the environment it is operating in. Stronger prompts can reduce weirdness, make role behavior more predictable, and cut down on edge case drift. The trick is that this kind of improvement is easy to feel and hard to market, which is probably why people undercredit it.
Compaction notices are another smart addition. Auto-compaction is one of those necessary subsystems that can feel spooky if the user never sees it coming. If context gets tight and the system silently compacts, the operator may only notice that the agent's behavior feels slightly different afterward. Notices solve that by turning hidden housekeeping into visible housekeeping. They do not eliminate compaction. They eliminate the weirdness of compaction feeling like a ghost process the user has to infer after the fact.
And compaction visibility matters more than it sounds, because compaction is not just a storage event. It can change what the model sees, how much detail survives forward, and which parts of a long-running conversation stay hottest in context. If that happens invisibly, users may treat a shift in behavior as moodiness or unreliability. If the product says, clearly, that compaction happened, then the user can reason about the new state instead of treating the system like it randomly forgot something important.
The same goes for the split between stable job definitions and churn-heavy runtime state. That is not simply cleaner architecture in the abstract. It changes debugging, review, and recovery. If a scheduled job starts misbehaving, you want the question to be, did the job definition change? Not, did a pile of runtime noise make the file look different again? Separating those layers gives operators a much cleaner mental model. Configuration stays configuration. Runtime state stays runtime state. That boundary helps the product feel maintainable.
Tiered pricing support also deserves a more explicit practical read. As soon as a product lets you choose between faster cheap models, slower expensive models, wider context models, and premium specialist lanes, the pricing model stops being trivia. It becomes part of operational policy. Which tasks get routed where? Which provider gets tried first? When is it acceptable to pay up for a better image or a larger context window? If the software cannot represent those pricing tiers cleanly, cost discipline becomes guesswork and routing intelligence stays shallow.
And this is exactly why these releases feel more important to real operators than they might look from the outside. They make the product more explicit about status, more explicit about ownership, more explicit about failure, more explicit about cost shape, and more explicit about where volatile state belongs. That may not sound like a dramatic vision statement. It sounds better than that. It sounds like a tool getting harder to misunderstand.
There is also a difference between more features and better product shape. v2026.4.20 and v2026.4.21 are useful because they improve product shape. Setup becomes easier to trust. Logs become easier to read. State becomes easier to manage. Permissions become easier to believe. Recovery becomes easier to attempt. None of those things require a giant new marketing noun. They require care around how the software behaves when it is not on stage.
And if you are the kind of user who ends up operating agents in chat channels, automation lanes, or mixed media flows, that distinction matters a lot. A tool can have incredible capability and still be exhausting if every serious task makes you wonder which provider it used, whether the permissions are truly enforced, whether the scheduler state is quietly getting weird, whether setup hid something important, or whether plugin recovery will become an archaeology project. These releases are moving in the opposite direction. Less archaeology. More clarity.
So if we reduce the release pair to one sentence, it is not OpenClaw added some nice quality of life fixes. It is that OpenClaw tightened several of the exact surfaces where operator confidence usually leaks away: defaults, logs, identity, state, pricing, compaction, recovery, and transport behavior. That is why this deserved the front half of the episode. These are the changes that alter whether the software feels easier to run next week than it did last week. And that points at the larger pattern across both releases. OpenClaw is not just changing capability surfaces. It is changing explanation surfaces. Better setup warnings. Better loading state visibility. Better fallback logs. Better compaction signaling. Better state separation. Better command enforcement. Better failure behavior around invalid browser refs. These are not separate random fixes. They all move in the same practical direction: less ambiguity between what the system is doing and what the human thinks the system is doing.
We should also talk about the cluster of runtime fixes across exec handling, codex transport, and plugin API behavior, because even though the show notes summarize them in one sentence, that sentence covers the exact layer where people tend to get cut. Exec handling is where commands touch reality. Transport handling is where provider and agent plumbing either stay coherent or start dropping context. Plugin API behavior is where integrations either feel like first-class citizens or start leaking friction. So even if each individual fix is small, the combined effect matters a lot. Products rarely feel broken because one giant subsystem exploded. They usually feel broken because a dozen sharp edges line up.
There is also a good product management lesson in this release pair. If you only read the version numbers and skim the highlights, you might say, okay, one release updated image defaults and another cleaned up some setup and state behavior. That is technically true and practically incomplete. The real story is that the product is getting stricter about guardrails, clearer about status, cleaner about runtime churn, and more current about the image lane it wants users to reach by default. That is what maturity looks like at this layer. Not bigger slogans. Better surfaces.
And because this episode is release first, let me make the user impact explicit instead of leaving it implied. If you mostly use the product for chat, the biggest improvements are probably the setup clarity and the stronger behavioral rails. If you use it for automation, the session caps, age pruning, separated cron runtime state, and failure fast behavior matter more. If you use it for media work, the move toward GPT image 2, the larger size hints, and the better fallback signal matter more. If you maintain packaged installs or plugins, the doctor recovery path matters more. Different users feel different pieces, but the pattern is consistent: less guesswork.
And that is why these releases deserved more than a flyby mention at the top of an otherwise generic news show. They are the kind of versions that tell you what the product is becoming. OpenClaw is becoming more explicit in setup, more legible in logs, more disciplined in state, more realistic about pricing, and more opinionated about its default image path. Those are not side notes. That is the actual product story for anyone who cares about whether the system gets easier or harder to operate over time.
So the clean summary of the release pair is this. v2026.4.21 sharpens the image and guardrail surfaces. v2026.4.20 sharpens the setup, state, and runtime surfaces. Put them together and you get a version pair that improves the daily operating texture of the product. The software explains itself a little better. The boundaries get a little tighter. The background churn gets a little more contained. The image path gets a little more current. That is the difference between a changelog that sounds modest and a product that actually feels better to run.
Now that the release details are on the table, the outside story that most deserves time is OpenAI Images 2.0. Not because it is a shiny model launch in the abstract, but because it appears to matter in exactly the kinds of image jobs that use to expose the limits of these systems immediately. For a long time, the easiest way to dismiss an AI image was to look at the text. Menus looked cursed. Posters collapsed into gibberish. Interface mockups were full of fake glyphs. Dense layouts broke down. So even when the imagery looked attractive, the output still struggled with the practical jobs that make image models operationally useful.
That is what makes Images 2.0 interesting. The reporting around it suggests a meaningful jump in readable text, UI-like composition, denser layouts, and instruction following for text-heavy visuals. If that holds up in repeated use, then the model becomes relevant to a much larger slice of builder work. Not just concept art. Not just stylistic experiments. Actual production-adjacent tasks like rough poster comps, ad concepts, product mockups, simple diagrams, slides, menus, social thumbnails, feature callout graphics, and interface-style layouts where text is part of the image rather than an afterthought.
That is the practical threshold. The question is no longer, can the model make a cool-looking picture? The question becomes, can the model reduce the number of times I have to leave the image lane because the text, layout, or composition collapses the second I ask for something structured? If the answer becomes yes more often, then the value of the model changes fast.
At the same time, this does not automatically erase Flux style or other open model workflows. Open image workflows still have clear strengths. They can be local. They can be cheaper over time if you already own the hardware. They give you more control over checkpoints, adapters, LoRaS, style consistency, and the exact generation stack. If what you care about most is local ownership, repeatable style tuning, or custom open workflows, then an API image model does not simply replace that.
But the competitive line moves when the closed model gets much better at the jobs open image tools often required extra cleanup to finish. If the work is readable text inside the image, fast branded layout, a serviceable UI mock, a quick menu, a structured poster, a comic panel with legible labels, a diagram that is not instantly embarrassing, or a thumbnail comp with real words in it, then Images 2.0 looks more relevant than older image models did. That does not mean it wins every case. It means it enters cases where it previously had no business being the default.
And that is why the OpenClaw release path matters here too. Moving the bundled image path toward GPT Image 2 is more significant if the underlying model has crossed into this more practical zone. A default only matters if the default is good enough to shape behavior. If the built-in image path remains mostly for novelty, users route around it. If the built-in image path suddenly gets good at structured, text-heavy work, then people start trying real jobs with it.
So let us make the workflow lens explicit. If you are doing pure style play, local experimentation, or highly customized open model iteration, open workflows still have obvious reasons to exist. If you are doing practical visual work where readable text and coherent layout are the bottleneck, Images 2.0 seems much more relevant. Think mock interfaces, diagrams, posters, slides, menus, thumbnails, feature graphics, ad concepts, and social creative where the image needs to carry legible information instead of just mood. In those workflows, a jump in text handling is not a nice bonus. It is the difference between prototype and usable draft.
There is also a second-order effect. Better text inside images does not only make legitimate workflows better. It also weakens one of the easiest human shortcuts for spotting synthetic content. People got used to scanning an image and saying, "Ah yes, the weird text gives it away." If that clue stops being dependable, then provenance matters more, platform policy matters more, and users have to get a little more mature about verifying origin instead of relying on obvious artifacts.
Which is one reason this story belongs after the OpenClaw releases, not instead of them. The OpenClaw pair is about defaults, logs, permissions, state, and operator clarity. Images 2.0 is about a model crossing into more practical structured image work. Those are separate stories, but they meet at the level of actual use. If the default image lane inside a tool gets better, the surrounding software has to be clearer about what model is being used, what the fallback behavior is, what the limitations are, and how people should reason about the output.
And that is where the practical comparison to open image workflows stays healthy instead of ideological. You do not need to pretend one side wins the entire category. You ask a narrower question. Which workflow is stronger for this job? If the job is open, local, heavily tuned, and style-specific, the open route may still win. If the job is fast structured visual work with readable text and clean instruction following, Images 2.0 looks like it may now win more often than older model generations did. That is the real update.
So the clean takeaway is that Images 2.0 matters because it looks less like a prettier toy and more like a tool that may change which image tasks people attempt through a default API lane. That is not a total replacement story. It is a workflow shift story. And those are usually the stories that end up mattering more than the benchmark hype.
The last story is shorter, but it still earns its place. YouTube is expanding its AI likeness detection technology to celebrities and the people who represent them. The reason that matters is not celebrity gossip. The reason it matters is that synthetic identity controls are becoming regular platform infrastructure. And it also belongs later in the episode, after the OpenClaw release details and the Images 2.0 workflow question, exactly where it sits here.
Exactly. Once a major media platform starts treating likeness detection like a product layer instead of an emergency add-on, it tells you something about where the abuse is expected to go. Face rights, and eventually voice rights, stop being exotic legal or moderation edge cases. They become ordinary operating requirements for platforms that host synthetic media at scale.
And YouTube is probably the right place to watch that transition because it already has the distribution surface, the creator economy pressure, and the moderation burden all in one place. If the platform thinks it needs enrolled likeness tooling for celebrities and their reps, that suggests the cost of synthetic identity abuse is high enough that a generalized report this video flow is no longer sufficient.
It also tells builders something useful. If image and video models keep getting better at realism, the surrounding systems will keep getting more specific about ownership, permission, and dispute handling. That is not abstract philosophy. That is product plumbing. The model gets stronger, and the platform has to become more explicit about who can challenge what.
Which is why this story works as a shorter closer rather than the center of the episode. It is important. But it is not more important than the OpenClaw release pair or the practical shift in image generation. It is a clean example of the next layer of platform response. Identity controls getting more formal because the generation quality is no longer weak enough to self-sabotage every bad actor.
And that is the right amount of time for it. Interesting, useful, relevant, but not the thing that should crowd out the release details or the bigger workflow question in image generation.
So the short version of EP036 is very straightforward. OpenClaw v2026.4.21 and v2026.4.20 deserved a release first episode because they materially change the honesty of the product surfaces people rely on: image defaults, fallback logs, owner-only commands, thread continuity, browser failure handling, setup flow, state cleanup, pricing support, compaction visibility, and runtime stability.
Then the outside story that mattered most was OpenAI Images 2.0, because a big jump in readable text and structured layout can change which image jobs are practical through a default API lane. That is a real workflow question, not just a model demo question.
And the YouTube story fits as the closer because it shows what happens when synthetic media quality keeps improving. Platforms stop treating likeness protection as a side issue and start treating it as infrastructure.
That is enough for one episode. We started with the OpenClaw release pair because those details actually matter. We moved next to Images 2.0 because better readable text changes practical image workflows. And we closed on YouTube because platform identity controls are becoming part of the normal stack. No filler required.
For links and coverage, head to tobeyonfitnesstech.com.
I'm Nova.
I'm Alloy.
And this is OpenClaw Daily.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon.